Hello students! Today's video lecture is going to include the functions of the nervous system, the different types of neurons that we can find within the nervous system, and finally, two different ways to classify nerves. We've already learned about one way. So let's get started. Now the nervous system controls so many different things within the body. It's hard to write out all the functions of the nervous system. So what we do is we kind of classify them based on what category they fall in. So one of the functions of the nervous system is to allow us to have sensation. We can see things, we can hear things, we can feel things, taste things, smell things, but it's more than that. We're keeping track of all sorts of different processes inside of our body. How much oxygen's in our blood, how much glucose or sugars in our blood, what's our blood pressure, what's our heart rate. We're monitoring or measuring all of those items. And so function number one, the nervous system allows for what's called sensory input. Now, that sounds kind of fancy. What does that mean? It means we have sensory or sense information, think your five senses, coming into the nervous system from the organs that are able to sense them. So information coming in from the skin, from the ears, from the eyes, from the tongue, from the nose, and then from all of those special cells that are keeping track of the things that I mentioned earlier: blood pressure, blood sugar, blood oxygen, etc. Okay, so I put a definition for sensory input that we are monitoring or measuring changes. That could be something changes and we can see it or hear it or feel it. Occurring outside of, those are our five senses, and inside of our body. You are probably completely unaware of most of those inside changes. However, one example that you're very aware of is when you have to go to the bathroom. There is a sensation that happens inside your body. Stretch receptors are telling you, hey, it's time to go. That's sensory input. Now, what happens with that information that's coming in from those organs that are measuring or monitoring? Function number two is called integration. Now, integration is a pretty fancy word, but really what it means is you're processing or interpreting that sensory input. It's the thinking. In addition, integration means not only are you able to understand what that information is that's coming in, what you're seeing, what you're hearing, but you're able to make a decision about what to do about that information. So notice the keywords here: processing, interpreting, and deciding. And what information are we using to make that decision? Whatever information's coming in from our senses, our external senses, eyes, ears, nose, etc., or our internal senses. So let's take these ideas and put them into a visual so you can understand a little bit more. Before we do number three, let's move down to our picture. And here we have a glass of water and an eyeball. And this eyeball is looking at the glass of water. We would classify our eye as a sensory organ because it gives us the sense of sight. So let's go ahead and add that in at the arrow. The fact that you're seeing this video right now, you're using your sensory organs. You're using your eye to view it, and you're using your ears to hear it. So that information is called sensory input. This blue thing right here is representing the cell that allows that information to travel, a type of neuron that we'll get to later. So remember, neurons generate electrical impulses when they are stimulated. So we actually have neurons in our eye, and when the light from whatever we're viewing hits those neurons, they make an electrical impulse, and that gets sent to the brain. Within the brain, we have special types of cells, special types of neurons that are able to do this integration process. And we'll talk about what type of neurons those are here, but this is another example of a neuron. So this blue is a neuron, this green is a neuron, and then our last function you can see is here in red. The brain decides what to do about that glass of water. Maybe you're thirsty and you want to drink the glass of water. So you see the glass of water as sensory input. Your brain says, hey, I'm thirsty. Let's go ahead and pick up the glass of water, and is able to send a message to your muscle to help you pick up that glass of water. The last function of the nervous system is what's called motor output, and that's the actual commands that your brain gives to your body to make it do something. So I've started out my definition. Motor output is when we activate our muscles, like we can see in this image, but that would also apply to a gland, and we'll talk more about that later. Um, and whenever your nervous system is commanding a part of your body, whatever that body part is that's receiving the command is called an effector. So I'm going to write that next. Okay, so full definition, motor output means we're going to activate muscles or glands, which are known as effector organs, and we're going to cause an appropriate response given the situation. So let's go back to our glass of water. Sensory input, we see the glass of water. That message travels to our brain. Our brain says, hey, I know what that is. It's a glass of water. And I'm thirsty, so I should probably drink that glass of water. Then the brain sends a command message called motor output to your skeletal muscle here, your biceps brachii, which is part of the solution. I want to pick up the glass of water and drink it. So I'm going to go ahead and label my biceps brachii here as an example of an effector organ. Again, an effector organ is any muscle or any gland of the body that receives a message from the nervous system telling it to do something, because it can cause an effect in the body. So notice I have color coded my definitions with the color that's down here, just to help you out. All right, let's take a look at another example and see if we can pick things out. The example is here inside this rectangle. You are driving and you see a red light. You move your foot to the brake pedal and you press, slowing the car to a stop because you know red means stop. So let's pick out the part of the example that's the sensory input, the part that's the integration, and the part that's the motor output. So in this example, the sensory input is what we're seeing, hearing, feeling with our skin, feeling inside, whatever. So in this case, we're driving and we see a red light. That is sensory input. So because seeing is a sense, that's why I'm putting it here with the sensory input. Now, what is it that we're going to have to process or know or decide in this example? When you see the color red, it means stop. So we know that the color red means stop when we see it in a stoplight. We also know that the brake pedal slows the car down. So those are the things that we have to know. Remember, you're not born knowing that red means stop, and you're not born knowing that the brake pedal slows the car down, or what the brake pedal is, or what a car even is. This is all stuff that you've learned over the course of your lifetime. So this is stuff we know, and we use it to make a decision. What's the decision, and what part of the body do we talk to? The decision is that we slow down. And so the motor output is you press on the brake pedal. You're telling your leg muscles to press on the brake pedal so the car slows down. So sometimes this is hard for students to dissect an example like this so specifically, because you don't even realize it's happening. It's a conditioned response. Once you learn how to drive, you don't even really think about pressing on the brake pedal anymore. You see the red light, you don't even notice that you're seeing it. It's not just a conscious thought you're having. You know that red means stop, and the brake pedal, we use the brake pedal to slow the car down, and you press the brake so it becomes automatic. So much of what we do every day, we don't even realize that it's really breaking down into these three examples. So pretty much everything we do has some form of sensory input, the information that we're using to make the decision, and then this is how our body is responding in order to carry that decision out. Okay, let's move on to the types of neurons. The types of neurons are 100% directly related to the functions that we just mentioned. So this page looks a little complicated. We do see some things that we recognize, so I want to go ahead and label those things before we get any further. One of the first things that we recognize on this page is the brain, and we see it twice. So I'm going to label that brain. Here's a brain, and under number 2, here's another brain. Maybe you're not sure exactly what this is. I'll show you in just a minute. I hope you recognize what this is. This is a section of skin. And then if we come down here, we recognize this is specifically the biceps brachii, but I want to be less specific and just call it a muscle. Remember, there's over 600 skeletal muscles in the body. And then I'm hoping you recognize this from our study earlier in the year. Gland, 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 pancreas is a gland, gland, ovaries and testes are all glands. So these, even though they're specifically labeled right here, we're just going to call them glands. Okay, so notice the title at the top, types of neurons. We're going to classify them according to their job or their functions. This is called a functional classification. All right, so we see a brain, we see a skin, we see this random something in between. This is a special type of neuron. It looks a little different than what we discussed before. So I'm going to go ahead and label its parts. It has all the same parts. It's just organized or structured a little differently. So if you remember, the way to find the cell body of a neuron is to find its nucleus. In this neuron, the nucleus is right here. So if that's the nucleus, that means this round part right here must be the cell body. Okay, what else? This off of the cell body are traditionally short extensions called dendrites, and we see that here where these are going to be the dendrites. In this case, the dendrites are set up a little differently and they're over here on this side. So we have multiple branches of dendrites, and then notice they kind of collect into one main one that goes to the cell body. So this is still considered a dendrite. I know this is strange compared to what we learned last lecture. And we do see some myelin sheath made by a Schwann cell. So this is pointing at this nucleus right here. So I know that this one's trying to represent the Schwann cell. And remember, the Schwann cell is the cell that produces this covering in yellow here, which is called the myelin sheath. So I'm going to label the yellow one the myelin sheath. Remember, that helps the electrical impulse get where it's going. And so what are we missing? If this side is the dendrites, this side must be the axon, and it is. So we have the axon over here. And then the axon ends in all of these branches, and we see that little tiny sort of larger spot at the end of each axon terminal called a bulb. So we know that this is the axon terminal section. Okay, so what is up with this neuron? It's different than what we learned before. And the reason is because this type of neuron is specially designed to be a sensory neuron. And so number one of the types of neurons is called a sensory neuron. And I'm going to highlight that so it stands out so it's easy to see. A sensory neuron. This is what sensory neurons look like. They have their cell body in the middle. Isn't that so weird? So what exactly is a sensory neuron? It's the special type of neuron that allows sensation. It carries sensory input. And it's coming from, in this example, it's the skin. It's coming from a sensory organ like the skin. And where is that information from the skin going to go? It's going to the brain. All right, so I'm going to highlight the rest of my definition so it's very obvious. Now, how do I know this is a sensory neuron? Number one, I know it's a sensory neuron because of how it looks. It's got this cell body in the middle, which is just typical of a sensory neuron. Number two, really important, we need to draw in an arrow that represents the direction that the electrical impulses are traveling. So sensory neurons always carry information from a sensory organ like the skin or an eye, ear, tongue, nose to the brain. And so even though the neuron is organized a little differently than what we've seen previously, it still carries the information in the same direction. So I'm going to use my yellow, and I'm going to make a zigzaggy line like this to represent the electrical information and how it's traveling in this direction from a sensory organ like the skin to the brain. What is it telling us? What is this information? I felt something. Oh, I got a splinter. Something hurts. That's warm. That's cold. All of those types of information can be passed from the skin through a sensory neuron and end up in the brain. Now, it's way more complicated than that, but that's the basic idea. So we have neurons that are responsible for a sensation, and they're called sensory neurons. Now, before I move on, I'm just going to label my little electrical message here. This is the direction of travel. I also want to tell you before we move on that see these dendrites right here? If I zoom in on my skin, those dendrites are these nerve endings here. We just don't see the rest of the cell because it's a cell. But these little sensory nerves in the skin, that's this part of the cell. And then the rest of the cell will stretch all the way out to the spinal cord. Okay, so you can see that I've labeled that little electrical signal, and the direction is traveling from skin through the sensory neuron to the brain. The second type of neuron is essentially the opposite and will carry information in the exact opposite direction. So let's go ahead, since we've already labeled a couple things in this section, let's go ahead and label the parts of this neuron. This one's much more standard and recognizable compared to what we learned last time. So let's start again with our nucleus. The area around the nucleus is always going to be the cell body. Generally, the cell body will have short extensions that are sensitive called the dendrites. Then the axon, it would be purple and it would be underneath all these little beans. So we're going to label the axon. And that'll extend away from the cell body. The yellow, again, represents the myelin sheath, which is the fatty insulation around the axon, helping the electrical message get where it's supposed to go. There's the nucleus of the Schwann cell again. And in this one, we actually have the gaps labeled. So if you remember from last lecture, the gaps between the myelin sheath are called the nodes of Ranvier. And then remember, at the very end of this long arm called the axon, we have our axon terminals. And those are the ones that are able to communicate with other cells, the communicating part of the cell. Okay, so now that we've got our neuron labeled, what kind of neuron is this? And I told you it goes in the opposite direction. So let's go ahead and put our electrical message in. The electrical message this time is going to go from the brain to either the muscle or the gland. Any of these glands. And again, I'm going to label my direction of electrical message. So what type of neuron carries messages from the brain out to the muscles or messages from the brain out to the glands? This is called a motor neuron. Motor neurons are the neurons that allow command messages to leave the brain and go to effector organs, parts of the body that can actually do something in response to the command. So I put in here motor neurons carry the motor output, which we know are the commands, to the effector organs, muscles, or glands. Muscles can contract in response to an electrical signal from the brain. Glands will release whatever hormone they make, which can make changes inside the body. So these are the things that can cause some kind of change in the body, depending on what the nervous system decides is appropriate. So I'm going to highlight that as well to kind of help it stand out. So that's what we learned about in our last lecture. We actually learned the parts of a motor neuron. These are very, very common. So sensory neurons carry information from a sensory receptor like skin, eye, ear to the brain. And then the opposite, motor neurons carry commands from the brain to the parts of the body that can do stuff. What is the third type of neuron then? Well, if you remember, this picture is similar to where we started. So let's look at our functions again. We have neurons that allow for sensation. We have neurons that allow for commands. And we have special neurons that allow for the thinking, the processing, and the deciding. That's our third type of neuron. And Generally, we find them in the brain or the spinal cord. They are called interneurons. Now, I do want to break down the word interneurons. Obviously, neuron is a neuron. That's the nervous system cell. But the word inter is a really important word part that means between. And that tells us where these neurons are kind of located. So let's take a look at our picture again. This guy is seeing his glass of water. This type of neuron right here, if you look carefully, look, these are dendrites, there's the cell body, and there's the axon terminal. So this is a sensory neuron here. Not so sure about this green one, but look at this red one. There's the cell body with its dendrites, axon, and axon terminals going from the brain to the muscle. So that's got to be a motor neuron there in red. And look at where this last neuron, the one in green, is positioned on the page. It's literally positioned between a sensory neuron and a motor neuron. Most of the time that's going to be in the brain and spinal cord. So that's why these special thinking, deciding, processing neurons are called interneurons, because they're in the pathway of information, they're between the sensory and the motor. So for the first part of the definition, I'm making a note that they're located in the brain and the spinal cord. They are positioned between sensory neurons and motor neurons. And their job is to do the integration, the processing, the deciding. So these are our smart neurons. The other ones just carry information or carry commands. These are the ones that decide what to do with the information and who to command in order to fix the problem if there's a problem. All right, so let's label those interneurons. And I'm going to highlight that so it's easy to pick out. Okay, so there's 3 different kinds of neurons. Now we're going to take this information and talk about the different kinds of nerves. Okay, so recall that the nervous system is made of 3 parts: the brain, the spinal cord, and the nerves. All 3 of those parts are made of neurons, the nervous system cell. We just finished talking about the fact that there's 3 different kinds of neurons, the cells. There's sensories, there's motor neurons, and then there's these ones, interneurons, that are in the brain and the spinal cord. So we've taken care of the type of neurons found in the brain and spinal cord. It's all interneurons. What type of neuron is found in the nerves? It's these 2. These 2 are found within the nerves, bundled into the fascicles, wrapped in all of the coverings. We find sensory neurons and motor neurons. So the last topic for today's lecture is there are 2 different ways to classify nerves. We've already talked about how to classify them anatomically. And I know that sounds really fancy, and it turns people off when you hear big words like that and you don't want to think about it. But anatomically just means, where are they located? What are they connected to? So if we're basing it on location or what part they're connected to, we have 2 types of nerves. We have what are called cranial nerves. We know those branch directly off the brain. And there are 12 pairs of nerves that branch directly off the brain. So that means there's a total of 24 nerves that come right out of the brain itself. If it's not a cranial nerve branching off the brain, then it's got to be a spinal nerve. And we know spinal nerves branch directly off the spinal cord. And from there, they'll go to all the different parts of your body, out all the way to the ends of your arms, all the way to the ends of the legs, into the abdominal and thoracic cavities, to your internal organs. And we have 31 pairs of spinal nerves. So this classification is just based on what they're attached to, either the brain or the spinal cord. Now, we can classify nerves based on what type of neuron is found inside of them. And remember, we're choosing from these 2 types of neurons, either sensory neurons or motor neurons, because these aren't found in the nerves. The interneurons are only found in the brain and the spinal cord. So functional classification is based on what type of neuron, or you could think of it as what type of message is carried inside the nerve. Notice we have 3 categories. So if the nerve if these nerves, for example, like you can see here, the cranial nerve or the spinal nerve, if we look inside and all we find are sensory neurons, we just call that whole thing a sensory nerve. So basically, the definition for sensory nerves are nerves that contain only sensory neurons and therefore carry only sensory input. So, for example, one of the nerves that comes right off your brain, that would be a cranial nerve, is called the optic nerve, and it comes right out of the back of your eye. This nerve is a sensory nerve. All it does, its only purpose is to carry the information from your eye to your brain. Your brain can't communicate back to your eye with this nerve. There's other nerves that make your eyeball move and change the diameter of your iris and all of that. So this is a one-way street, if you want to think about it this way. And that's called a sensory nerve because it only carries sensory information in. No information ever goes back the other way because the type of neuron that's in there won't allow it. So some of our nerves are classified as sensory nerves. Maybe you can guess what the opposite of a sensory nerve is. The opposite of a sensory nerve is a motor nerve. Guess what motor nerves have inside of them? Motor nerves are nerves that contain only motor neurons and they therefore carry only motor output. Motor nerves are nerves that contain only motor neurons. Let's look again at our motor neuron. That's the one that sends messages from the brain to the body parts, either muscles or glands. So that's the only kind of neuron that we find in there. And so therefore, a motor nerve only gives command messages. It only carries command messages. Okay, so before I showed you the optic nerve was called a sensory nerve because it only carries sensory information into the brain. There's another nerve here, several nerves specifically, but I want to concentrate in on this nerve right here, and it's called the oculomotor nerve. That nerve, as you can see, goes to these muscles of the eye. Watch this nerve, and I'm going to put my arrow on here. It only carries command messages to your eyeball muscles to allow you to look around, open your eye, etc. So this nerve, because it only sends messages from the brain, which is over here, I know that's hard to tell, only sends messages from your brain to the muscles and only has motor neurons in it, it's called a motor nerve. So what's the last category? Because we've actually talked about only sensory, only motor. There's one more possibility. What if a nerve has both kinds of neurons in it? Is that possible? It is absolutely possible, and it's most likely that nerves contain both types of neurons, and when they do, we call them mixed nerves because they have both kinds of neurons inside of them. Okay, mixed nerves, nerves that contain both sensory neurons and motor neurons. So both types of neurons. Mixed nerves carry both sensory input and motor output. They are the typical two-way street. Messages are going in both directions inside this nerve. And it turns out that most of the nerves, all of your spinal nerves, and most of your cranial nerves are mixed nerves, meaning information goes up to the brain and out of the brain to the body inside the same nerve. That's the reason why nerves have to be broken into bundles called fascicles, because some of those fascicles carry sensory neurons and some of those fascicles have motor neurons. It's pretty fascinating. So the main point here, going back to the idea, nerves, the organs that we see, are made of neurons. If they have only sensory neurons, we call them a sensory nerve. If they have only motor neurons, we call them a motor nerve. If they have both types of neurons, we call them a mixed nerve, and that's the most common type. The brain and the spinal cord are made of only the interneurons. Those are our thinking or processing or deciding neurons, and they are located between the sensory neurons and the motor neurons in the brain and spinal cord. So there you have it. I'll see you next time.